Welcome. My name is Warwick Sabin. I'm the Executive Director of the Society of Fellows at the Aspen Institute, and it's definitely my pleasure to welcome you to this Freedom from Fear forum that we're pleased to present in partnership with the Aspen Institute's arts program, as well as the Four Freedoms Initiative. This is a very important subject. We're going to be examining how the arts address so many of the hottest topics in politics, including bias, racism, sexism, gun violence, and criminal justice reform. And this is something that uniquely the Aspen Institute is positioned to do, and we're so pleased to bring together such a diverse group of experts on so many subjects to talk about these subjects over the course of the half day that we're gathered here today. The program, of course, is in front of you if you want to examine it, but it's my pleasure to introduce Rabia Chaudry, who's going to be moderating our very first panel. Rabia is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Adnan Story, and she's the executive producer of the Emmy-nominated HBO docuseries, The Case Against Adnan Syed. She's an attorney and partner at Chaudry & Anwar Immigration Law Firm, where she supervises asylum cases and immigration appeals. She's also very well known as the co-host and co-producer of the hit criminal justice podcast, Undisclosed, and the political podcast, The 45th, with nearly 300 million downloads combined. So please join me in welcoming Rabia Chaudry.
Good morning, Society of Fellows. I'm really excited and honored to be not just here as somebody who's going to join you and watch the other panels as well and learn a lot, but also to be moderating this amazing panel of artists who and thinkers and academics who have done such important work on these issues. So I'm going to start off by introducing our panel. First we have with us Professor Jennifer Eberstadt. And Jennifer is the professor of psychology at Stanford, and she is the author of Biased, a book called Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. Good morning, Jennifer. Next, we have artist Marilyn Minter. Marilyn is a visual artist best known for her thought-provoking and sensual paintings and photographs done in photorealism style that challenge the ideas of gender bias and sexism. Marilyn's work spans over 4 decades, and there's so much there, but in 2018, she collaborated with Four Freedoms, which is an artist-run platform for civic engagement. Good morning, Marilyn. Thanks for joining us. And finally, we have Sanford Biggers, a Harlem-based interdisciplinary artist who works in film, video, installation, sculpture, music, and performance. Sanford's themes are meant to broaden and complicate our read on American history, and I'm really excited to explore that. Year after year, Sanford is recognized for his work, and most recently this year, he was inducted into the New York Foundation for Arts Hall of Fame. So please join me in welcoming the panel. So in order to understand how bias, influences and impacts politics, justice, society, public discourse, really our everyday lives, we have to first understand what bias means. What is bias? What is prejudice? So I'm going to turn to Professor Eberstadt and ask you, can you explain to us what bias is and who is biased?
Right. Thank you. So bias or implicit bias or unconscious bias can be defined as the beliefs and the feelings that we have about social groups that can influence our decision-making and our actions even when we're not aware of it. So typically when people think about bias, they think about people burning crosses or people who are inspired with hate. But you don't have to be evil. You don't have to be a bad person to have biases, and it's something that we're all vulnerable to, and it can be triggered, and it can have devastating impact despite our intentions to be fair, and despite our desire to act in ways that are more egalitarian. It's something that can affect everything from who we see as suspicious in our neighborhoods to who teachers discipline in school to how promotions and how hiring is even decided in the workplace. It also is something that can affect various actors in the criminal justice system. So in my own research, I've shown that just exposing people, for example, to African American faces can lead them to see blurry images of weapons better. So this clicker is not working, but I want you to see that image. I don't know if we could advance it. Okay, and can you advance it again? I don't know why this isn't working. So this is just showing you the study that I've done where we would expose people to African American faces on a computer screen and then show them a blurry image that gets clearer and clearer. And we find that just exposure to those black male faces leads people to be able to detect that gun faster. So it's almost as though bias is working as this like visual tuning device where we're able to see objects that are relevant to the stereotype with greater clarity. We've done other studies as well where we've worked with police officers and we prompt them to think about violent crime. And when we do, we see that just sort of thinking about violent crime can lead them to direct their eyes away from a white face and towards a black face. So I have an image of that too. I don't know, the clicker is not working, so I guess I'm going to have you. Thanks. Although looking black is not a crime, we have done studies where we show that jurors are more likely to sentence a black person to death when that black person has more stereotypically black features. So there's just one more slide that I want to show. The blackness of your physical features, this kind of bias can influence death sentencing decisions. And even voters are affected by this. So for example, the more black that they see the prison population as being, the more supportive they are of punitive criminal justice policies like stop and frisk and policies like 3 strikes and so forth. And what we find drives this is fear, actually. So the more, black people see the prison population being, for example, the more fearful they are that crime will get out of control without more punitive policies, and the more they're likely to support those policies. So fear is a main driver here. It drives, how voters vote. It drives how jurors sentence. It drives where police officers look. It drives what we see. So fear is a major motivator here.
So, I was once doing some research on how bias impacts the criminal justice system, specifically because that's a big interest of mine. And I read that there are over 180 cognitive biases that exist, different kinds, like if they're actually enumerated, which just is so expansive. Then how do you regulate? You can't really regulate human bias, right? In this, and then at what point does bias become bigotry is the real question for me. Because if we all now have natural human bias, how do we prevent that from becoming bigotry if it's just such a natural part of being human?
Yeah, yes, to be human is to have lots of biases. It has to do with how our brains are wired and, how our brains actually have, shortcuts or tricks to help us to deal with the amount of information that we are confronted with and that we have to sort through. And so we have these biases that kind of help us to do that. But those biases actually can go awry, right, and have a real negative impact on other people. And so that's why we want to figure out ways to manage it. And And bias, I think as soon as you think about it as something that's not just like a personality trait, like a stable trait that someone has, but it's something that can be triggered by the situations we find ourselves in. So once you understand what the conditions of bias are, what the situations are under which bias will be triggered, it gives you actually a lot of control over it. So it's not something that we're kind of doomed to live with. We actually have more control over it than we think.
I want to talk next a little bit about the relationship of bias and bigotry to power and agency. And so these questions are for Marilyn and Sanford, but certainly Jennifer as well.
If this works.
I think it's on.
It's on?
It's
Okay.
on, yeah. If you could both maybe address, how you see your art and how it responds to bias and bigotry, we can start there.
Okay, does it work? My whole, oh, it's working. All right, thank you. No, it isn't. Well, this is a still or a video? Does anyone know? Okay, well, I would just talk about, a lot of the work I do is really addressing, I definitely agree with everything you're saying, and that everything comes from fear. And I think everyone basically is biased and sexist and homophobic and racist and anti-Muslim. And I do think that the only way we can fight that is mindfulness and opposite behavior. It's a trick that I use whenever I see, and I see it all the time, coming towards young women or any kind of youngish women, anyone using sexual agency or sexual imagery, because there's a huge glass ceiling. It's always been part of the male power structure, and women owning that is so threatening. And my best example is, there's so many. I mean, I feel this is what women really have to do, in my estimation, is rethink how they attack one another. And it's just, I think maybe it's it comes from like there's only so many slices in a pie, and equality is not pie, and that there's plenty of room for other women. And I see the way that the culture builds up these young girls like Lena Dunham or Taylor Swift, and really builds them up, and then they become totally uncool. It's just this constant tearing down, and that drives me crazy. And I look, there's this kind of rethinking that women have to, especially because we're, I don't know whether it's culture or innate, or, maybe it's from your DNA trying to, get the guy who can kill the most buffalo. I'm not, I'm just an artist who's observing culture. But there's a trick to this, and if as women, instead of seeing another artist that's really good, this is what I do. And it's another woman artist, I just want to kill her. I want her dead. And I rethink it, and I say, okay, this is the trick. I go over to every one of them that I love the work, and I tell them how much I love the work, and the poison drains just by saying it, and then we become colleagues and friends. And it was a really hard thing to do. I don't want to do it, but I make myself do it. So we have to, I know that this is in me, so what I do is opposite behavior, absolute opposite. I don't want to retweet Nicole Eisman, but I do. And when I see her, I praise the hell out of her. Same with Lorna Simpson, same with Cindy Sherman. I know to do this, because these are my heroes, even though I don't like them being so good. But, intellectually, their talent makes me a better artist, because then I have to get better too. I have to, it's like a healthy competition. Maybe it's what Picasso and Matisse had. And so I'm not, I'm just an artist, just a dumb old artist trying to make work. But I did make, once Trump won, it just like the bottom fell out of my life for a minute. And I thought, well, if we're going to be called cunts, I'm going to shove it down their throats. And I made this video. And I don't know why this clip isn't working. Oh, yeah, it is. And this is the director of my gallery. Now she's at Gagosian. She sold more work of mine than anybody ever. And so I had all these different people, young people, old people, writing different words, changing the meaning. So it's called My Country, 'Tis of Thee, C-U-N-T-R-Y. And these are just clips for the shows that I've had. I don't want to show you the whole video, it's 8 minutes. Do you want to show the next one, please? Oh, does it work? Okay. Whoops, go back. All right, oh, these are paintings I'm doing now. And they're pretty big. They're like 8 feet, 7 feet. And I was just, this is one of the things I'm concerned with. And we're all used to seeing women grooming in the culture and in art history and in painting, women taking baths, Daphne surprised by Apollo, women like sort of semi-porn, but it's actually fine art because it's part of the gaze. We all love those paintings. They're historically brilliant. And I thought, well, we never see women painting grooming. I mean, there is a handful. There's myself and Mary Cassatt and Lisa Yaskavich, and there might be one or two others. But I've really researched this, and I can't find any. So I thought, since this is a whole historical, it's a very important historical trope, and it's the way we present ourselves. I thought, well, what does it look like a 21st century bather? So these are women in the shower. And they're big paintings, and I'm doing a whole show of them in France. Which is where we think of Degas and Monet and and Renoir and all what we're most familiar with. Even though the first painting I could find was Georges de Latour, and it's a woman picking off fleas, and that's the earliest. So and then the next one, I guess. Oh no, that's you, right? Yeah, but I could talk about you. I have another clip in here, I think. Maybe it's the first one. Oh, it is those two. She showed me 4. Oh, well, so, okay, that's that one, and then that's that one, I guess, but you're next. So.
Okay. Hi. As mentioned, I'm Sanford, and let's see. I've been thinking a lot about historical amnesia and how it relates to bias. Historical amnesia and how it relates to bias. I'm thinking about the first few times I personally experienced bias, and one that really sticks out was at this point in high school, and I started at a very prestigious private school. I purposely got kicked out and ended up in a public school. However, my older brother and sister finished through those private schools and went on to Harvard and Berkeley and so on. So I was in the college counselor's office and trying to get some guidance on what to do with my future. And this person looked over the desk and she said to me, he's like, oh, if you really strive, you might be able to get into a junior college here in Los Angeles. And I looked at her like she was crazy. And here I was, maybe 14 or 15 at this point. And as I mentioned, my whole family had gone to college, and that was just sort of part of the routine in my family. And for her to see me and not even assess anything about my life and to sort of tell me what I can strive for struck me as odd. I called her out on it. At that time, I was taken to the principal, explained that to the principal, and the principal was like, okay, I sort of get what you're saying here. Years later, after I'd gone to college, I went to Morehouse College in Atlanta. Now I was asked to come speak at that same high school. And when I was speaking, I literally said right there, you have to hold your counselors and your teachers accountable for your future. They're here to serve you. You're here to do what you do. If you're doing your job correctly and they're doing their job correctly, you should be able to go any place you want. And it was just such a basic thing. But I realized at that point that there were some serious issues. Also, speaking of education, I also grew up in a household where We went to schools, great schools, and we learned a lot from those schools. However, there was some very significant things missing, and that usually included brown and black people, contributions of women, and so on. This is a problem in the educational system, as many of you know, especially looking from this room. We're all from an age where there was a lot of information that was missing in our education system. And seeing that, my family giving me this sort of ancillary education at home about, okay, well, these are some things that black and brown and females and so on have done that you're probably not learning in school. I always felt that I was informed beyond what I was getting directly from those classes. And this is including the public and private school. Neither of them are addressing these issues. So I sort of, as I got deeper into becoming an artist, I wanted to find ways to address some of this. I think I agree with the whole panel that fear is one of the driving forces for bias. One of the ways I want to combat against that is through exposure. The more exposure people have to one another, I mean, this is America. If you don't know your neighbor and you have access to your neighbor, that's a problem, because we make these assumptions and we're fed propaganda. And if we don't, for ourselves, reach out and find and meet people, there's no way that we can see past that. I know it's simple, and it's to just agree with what you're spoon-fed, but it's not as rewarding, and obviously we have problems from that. Let's see if, okay. So this is an older work. This is from around 2007, 2008, and it's called Lotus. And what you're looking at is a 7.5-foot glass disc with hand carving and hand etchings directly on it. And it looks sort of like a lotus blossom, which it's named after. The lotus in Buddhist culture is a symbol of wholeness, purity, triumph. And this particular lotus, let's see if we can make this work. Nope. Uh-oh. Well, there's supposed to be another slide. If that slide were there, the closer you get to this piece, as you zoom in, you realize that all of those petals that make this lotus are actually cross-sections of slave ships. And these are diagrams that were made by 18th century slavers of how to best pack human cargo as they were being taken from Africa throughout the rest of the world. And there's over 6,000 figures carved in this, so it's actually really sort of rewarding to get in close and start to see the detail of all the bodies that are in there. This piece was originally, as an object, I was very interested in creating this, but for me, the next part was the context of where it would be viewed. This piece started in Kansas City, where it was actually fabricated, and it was shown at a not-for-profit gallery. And that was fine, once again, for sort of the artistic impetus. But the next show I had was in Richmond, Virginia, where this was literally hundreds of feet from the James River, where several 100,000 of slaves were taken for auction right there in an area called Shockoe Bottom, where this piece was shown. And at that point, it seemed like this was almost a century, or the iris looking at the history that had gone across the James River. And for me, it was starting to get closer to the context I wanted. Around a year and a half after that, I was invited to do a show right here in New York City at the Rubin Museum, which is a Buddhist museum. And of course, this being related to mandalas, that was the ideal space for this to be, because it was speaking directly in that classical language of the mandala, but it was also telling the story, a very specific story of American history. So let's see, next piece. Around the same time, I did this work right here. This is called Blossom. And what you're looking at is a sculpted tree with a piano. It's growing through the piano and pushing the piano off of its feet. And in the front, you might be able to notice there is a piano stool that's kicked over, as if somebody were standing on that, and they kicked that out as they were lynching that person from the tree. But the dichotomous meaning of this also refers back to Buddhism, because that, of course, is where the Buddha finds enlightenment, is under the tree. And this piece was really inspired by an incident that happened in Louisiana, in Gina, Louisiana. Several of you may remember the Gina 6 incident, which happened at a high school, a relatively integrated high school in Gina, Louisiana, where one afternoon, a black student approached the teacher and asked the teacher if they can go sit under this tree. The teacher asked, "Why would you even need to ask me about that?" But the reason was because this is where all the popular white kids were sitting, so there was no black kids under the tree. And the teacher said, "Of course, go sit under the tree." Student goes over there, And slowly but surely, the white students sort of disappear and leave that child alone by the tree. The next morning when everyone arrives at school, there were actual nooses hanging from that tree. And that started, several events caused by that racial tension that culminated around 8 or 9 months later when a group of black students were going into a corner store and a group of white students were coming out and there was a confrontation between them. The white kids pulled out a gun, the black kids somehow beat up the white kids and took the gun, and when the cops came, the black kids were arrested because they stole the gun. So as a result of that, several people went down to Gina, and there was protests and so on. But for me, that was such an interesting incident because it happened in 2007, 2008, and here we are still talking about lynching and having this type of these confrontations. And I was teaching at Columbia at the time, and at Columbia, as a result, in that same time frame, there were nooses that were hung on black professors' doors at Columbia, right here in this city. So, obviously, this seems so old at this point. This was 2008, and we've all seen so many more horrific images since then. But that just goes to show you that without this type of exposure and conversation, that we're just repeating our past. In fact, I don't even know if there are past. It just seems like it's our never-ending present. So through this type of exposure and having people see these works and, they're seduced by the physicality of them, but as they start to learn the backstory, they're realizing that there's other messages in there. I think that's sort of metaphorically what I think the exposure amongst people here is one of the rewards of that.
Sanford, can I ask you, especially as we're looking at your work, but you've talked about historical amnesia, and to me, amnesia seems like kind of an involuntary, passive process. How much of it is really amnesia, and how much of it is really deliberate erasure?
An interesting thing, some of you may have read this. In the last several weeks, there's been complaints at tours throughout the South at plantations. And there are white folks that are going to plantations and receiving the tour and then complaining about the tone and the information that is given to them at those tours. They don't want to hear about the violence and brutality against slaves. They don't want to feel that they are being accused of being part of that history. They actually went there to see the botanicals and learn how different types of flowers and plants, flourished in this area, and all these other things outside of the realm of the fact that these things existed as holding tanks and workhouses for enslaved people. So I think that right there, the fact that those arguments are actually getting press and continuing and getting a louder voice because now they want to revise the way slavery is taught at a plantation, that is historical amnesia, and it is deliberate. We talk about gaslighting a lot right now. That's part of historical amnesia. Not teaching real American history in American schools is historical amnesia.
I want to go circle back to the question about the relationship between bias and power. And as an American Muslim who's grown up in the United States, post 9/11, to me that relationship has looked like an endless war on terror against people who look like me. It's looked like bans of refugees. It's looked like a lot of different things. And so I do want to ask, Jennifer, can you talk to us a little bit about the relationship between bias and power, and how bigotry informs power?
Yeah, I think, so we all have biases, as I said, but there are, power can, affect, the expression of those biases. Power can, affect the impact that your bias can have on other people and the rest of the world. Bias can shape worlds, right? They can shape, social and physical environments such that, certain people are, excluded, or, certain people are sort of demeaned in various ways. And so, power plays a big role here in how we're impacted by bias.
Did you want to address that as well? How do you see your art challenging bias in power structures?
I think, you were talking about historical amnesia. too. And I look at all these women artists who are just has been erased. Same thing. There was this book that just came out by Mary Gabriel called Ninth Street Women. And I mean, nobody, when I first moved to New York, I didn't even think about Helen Frankenthaler, or even Joni Mitchell, who I think is just brilliant, both of them. And this book, I mean, Joan Mitchell was the American representative at the Venice Biennale. When I came here, she was not, you never saw anything about her. You only heard about, Conrad Macchiarelli and Twombly. I mean, these are second-class artists next to Joan Mitchell and Helen Frankenthaler. And it's just now that people are realizing that they've always been these women artists all throughout history that have just, as soon as they actually had an impact, and then they get erased historically. And I know it has, race is so much more powerful because women do, they were allowed to make art, but it drives me crazy. And I think that all we have to do is constantly have these really difficult conversations. Because nobody, I'm listening to 1619, and it almost kills me to listen to it. Or I saw the Black Art show at the Musée d'Orsay, the Black models, and I thought I couldn't even take a picture of it to post. The only thing I liked was the Glenn Ligon who put all the models' names in lights. And he, at the entrance, I mean, these are the names of the models that were in all these paintings that have just been, they've also all disappeared too. But it's painful, but we gotta look at it, otherwise we're never gonna get to the other side. And I think that light is a disinfectant, and talking and having these conversations. That's the only way we're ever gonna see any kind of justice.
See, Edward, I don't know if I interrupted you. Were there more pieces to show as well? I believe there were.
We don't know.
We'll find out. Let's all be surprised together.
Slides are on random at this point. So
Okay. You want to click?
let's see what happens. Oh, okay. So that was there. Okay. What I forgot to mention about this piece is when you walk towards it, the piano literally starts playing, and it plays my own interpretation of Billie Holiday and Abe Mirapul's "Strange Fruit," which of course is about black bodies hanging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
Is that at the Brooklyn Museum?
That's at the Brooklyn, yeah, that's part of the permanent collection of the Brooklyn Museum. Sorry, that was the sound. This is what I was looking for to show you. Let's see if this works. So I think somehow related to the last question, this body of work is called BAM, where I've been taking found African sculptures and dipping them in wax, taking them to a shooting range and literally sculpting them with different caliber weapons. So 22 gauge shotguns, 12 gauge shotguns, not Glock 9mm pistols, and each different type of gun leaves a different mark. What I then do is take the remnants from that shooting experience and then I cast them in bronze. So there's a bit of a transubstantiation between wood now to bronze. And of course, this starts to reference classical sculpture and the traditions, the Greco-Roman sculptural traditions. And this particular piece, I was commissioned to do an 8-foot version. And this is at the very end of the Equal Justice Initiative Museum in Alabama that just opened, Brian Stevenson's project. And this museum is dedicated to the history within America of terrorism through Jim Crow, abduction from Africa of people who became enslaved people once they were in America, and ultimately the criminal justice system. So as you go through this museum and learn all of these different aspects of history, this is the last piece you see on your way out. And for me, when these pieces get put in those type of institutions where it's not just being shown in a gallery or a museum in the city where art fans come to see it, when this is interacting with regular people who see it as a memorial or a monument, they're not necessarily thinking about the sort of charged history of art but more social justice and how this relates to them or how it relates to current events. And I think what that does is end up sparking some of these conversations. In fact, I was invited to speak at the TED conference in Canada a few years ago, and I spoke specifically about this, and at this point, over 1.5 million people have seen that TED talk. So gradually these things get out there and they disseminate some of this information that's contrary to what we might get through the mainstream media.
I mean, clearly art is a powerful medium. We're going to move to Q&A. One last question that I have. Clearly art is a powerful medium to challenge biases that exist and also tell stories that are not told. But Jennifer, I want to ask you, what does empirical evidence tell us? What does research tell us, like, is the most effective way to challenge bias?
You know, some of the most effective ways you all have talked about, I think contact, but it's contact with other groups, but it's not sheer contact. The nature of that contact matters a lot, right? So it has to be contact that's equal status, that is where you're coming together with, sort of not competitive, but sort of cooperatively, you're working on common goals. It has to be sort of contact that's sort of personal and sustained and so forth. So there are a lot of conditions just to contact, but contact does work. Slowing down is a huge one. A lot of times we act on our biases because we don't have time to think. We don't have time to sort of really think even about alternatives, or we can't be reflective, right? And I think you mentioned the power of reflection is huge. But when we're pushed, we don't get to be reflective. And what happens is we have these automatic associations in our mind, like stereotypic associations, say, about certain groups that get triggered and kind of leap forward and can infect our decision making. So speed is a big trigger of bias. Lack of contact or negative contact is a big trigger. These emotional states that I talked about, fear, but not only fear, but even when we're under stress, even when we're fatigued, like our sort of bodily conditions, right, can influence whether we're more or less likely to act on bias. Cultural norms also are huge, and you can have a cultural norm in a specific space, but we can also have norms societally, like nationally. And the question is, are our cultural norms around like having egalitarian values being eroded now? And as that shifts and as that erodes, that's going to lead to the triggering of more bias and so forth. So we know as researchers a lot about the conditions under which bias can really affect us.
Great, thank you. So we're going to open the floor for questions. I think we have about 10 minutes, but I have really no idea. So we'll just start with whoever would like to ask a question. Every one of you is thinking thoughts. I know this. Oh, yes, right here in the front.
Well, I appreciate all your comments, and I don't have a question per se, but I was just interested in your particular reaction to competition, meaning you want to kill the adversary, so to speak, or the person that you're competing with.
Someone who's really talented.
Yeah. Okay. This is a thing of power is in, achievement and opportunity and so forth. And competition, the opportunity to compete is a very important power that we all want to have. But I think we all have different reactions to competition. I like competition. I think it's wonderful from my point of view, and I never felt I wanted to kill them. I find it inspiring to see what other people are doing. So I think we all, it's good that we own up to what we're feeling because we're in a better position to get along with people. But we all have different reactions, that's all.
Well, male artists are always competitive with each other also. I mean, I think it's part of the nature of the beast. Artists are narcissistic, soul-suckingly self-involved. Would you agree? It's like we don't have any choice here. So the best we could do is reflection. And yes, competition is really healthy if you can go there, but that's what our goal is. I mean, I compete with him.
I also agree with what you said. The final comment you made about that is that competition really brings out the best in each of us.
But you have to go to that place where you praise the person,
Yeah.
and then because of social media, you get to act on it.
The writer Roxane Gay has a really interesting and ongoing obsession with a nemesis. Nobody knows who it is, but you can follow her on Twitter, and she's written essays about nurturing this kind of angst against her nemesis and the value in that. And I thought
Grudges
that was
are like pets; you tend to them very well.
right, exactly. We have another question over here.
Now, I'm curious about, have you ever felt that you've really reached somebody who didn't already agree with you? In other words, I love your comment about the piece not just being in a gallery, but being in a museum where there's some context. But somebody who's going to go to that museum probably is already a lot of the way there. How do you know, or have you ever had a feeling where, wow, I really broke through to somebody who thinks differently about this?
There's been a couple of examples, and interestingly enough, at the Equal Justice Initiative, it actually was one of them. I think a lot of people went to that museum because it was such a big event for Alabama in general. Reports say that the tourist income of the state was something, it was like 3 or 4 times its normal average due to the opening of that museum. So there was people of all kind going to see it. And they leave comments. And sometimes they say, oh, something about this piece really resonated with me. I never thought about it this way. I mean, the piece it's very dramatic. You hear the gunshots, it's very visceral. And it affects people in a way that speaking about it or reading about it doesn't. So, and that's one of the reasons I did it. I mean, I have the utmost deference for those objects, but I felt so traumatized by seeing dead and dying bodies on TV every week that I was like, I have to sort of sacrifice these objects to make a point, to get the attention of people. So, and I think somehow that intent even comes through. I also am on the college circuit speaking at various universities, and during the question and answers you might get a comment, but definitely when it's done, there's always a line of people talking to you, and there's someone saying, you know what, there was a time I couldn't even hear what you're saying to me right now, but over the last few years or whatever, my mind is opening to this, and I guess what happens is people start to touch into their inner empathetic human and start to realize we're not all that different when it comes down to it. So it's gradual, it's a gradual thing. And to convert any person, even if it's just one, is an accomplishment, I believe.
Just a question that you may have covered because I came in a bit late, but the relationship between stigma and bias, because I think part of what the art is responding to is that that's a stigmatic condition that is evoking the bias. Not sure.
Yeah. Was that a question for
I
the
think
artist?
any one of the panelists could, yeah. And the question is the relationship between stigma and bias.
Oftentimes when people talk about bias, they're talking about sort of, these thoughts and feelings that we have about other groups that can lead to harm. But stigma is about being a target of bias. And sort of stigma is about what that state feels like and how you manage being a target as well. We were talking about managing our own biases, but when you're a target of bias, you have to figure out ways to manage that as well to stay safe and whole.
I think it's very interesting because I don't know if you're all seeing the same image as I am, but behind you all is this who is a threat, who is a victim, and it seems very much like what you're speaking about right there. You see the same black man in 4 different outfits, and which one of them is the threat? And it's that stigma, walking around knowing that people are looking at you, trying to assign these various identities onto you when they might be contrary to your being.
Just yesterday, I saw, I'm from the Baltimore area, a new restaurant in a very hip part of town that put up a sign that said, you will not be seated and served if you are dressed in like a whole list of different ways, including baggy jeans, a hat with a rim that's not facing forward. It just, anything with a hood, it just went, it's like, just come out and say it. Just come out and say it. Exactly what you're talking about. And it's kind of shocking.
I have a question. I'm wondering, how do you function in this system that benefits from the bias? I mean, it has been progressing and to the point where we find ourselves in a very polarized situation at the moment. And it's sort of like as a follow-up to that question about how do you reach out to those people who have been polarized by this bias that has been, I mean, even the media keeps doing this, keeps building on the fear without seeing that what they're doing is just, even though they may seem like a liberal media, they're not. So I'm wondering any thoughts that you may have on that.
Well, I mean, I think, there's a generosity for people, all the panelists today, there's that sense of generosity. We want to actually interface with people so that we can have these conversations, so that we can construct different information streams beyond the media that is, sort of pushed down on us. And yes, that type of bias and stereotyping, all of that benefits the media. It gets ratings. It works.
I was thinking about, the biggest one, this is like a conversation, and it's a conversation in the culture, but this is the one that slut-shaming drives me crazy. And I watched Miley Cyrus, being totally slut-shamed for having that finger, whereas, and being sexual on stage, whereas, Justin Bieber, what's his name, Justin Timberlake? Yeah, whatever his name is. They can use
Beaver.
Yeah. It's like, why is it that she's singled out and slut-shamed and by other women and by, that conversation is very rarely mentioned. I think that's one of the biggest threats in the culture to women is them owning sexuality.
Well, I think also social media aids that a lot, right?
Yeah.
That's through social media. One, it's a lot. Oftentimes, it's anonymous, right?
Mm-hmm.
That when it's when you don't have to be named, people do all kinds of bad things and negative things to one another in those situations. And also, it's I talked before about sort of thinking fast and how when you don't have time to slow down, you're more likely to act on bias. And so the social media is a recipe for that, right? You're responding quickly, you're getting sort of images quickly. It doesn't lead to reflection at all, which is and productive conversation, which is what we need.
I mean, maybe it's because I'm an attorney, but I've always thought, you can't really, we're never going to get rid of human bias, so you need, to protect people through, law and policy and statute and regulation and all these things. But having said that, I've always struggled as an advocate to try to understand, is the most impact bottom up or top down? We have conversations in the community. How impactful those conversations is from top down, the messaging is so overwhelmingly negative.
I think we need to pull whatever levers we have at whatever level. I think I hear this question a lot, as a social psychologist, right? Because people feel like, oh, well, you're, just looking at individual bias, and it's really like the structural bias that matters, and we should be sort of thinking about policy, and we should be sort of thinking about these issues at an institutional level, because that's where the power is, and that's where change is. And I just feel like change is possible everywhere, and that we shouldn't let ourselves off as individuals off the hook, like as though we're not responsible at all for perpetuating this. And it's there's a bidirectionality there. So right, so institutions affect us, structures affect our minds, and our minds then build those institutions and build those structures and support those structures and policies and practices and so forth. So we can't do one without the other. It's not like there's a certain location in space where we can, if we just hit right there and dealt with that, this will all be over.
Oh, do we have time for one more question? Yes? Okay. One last question, yes.
Hi, first of all, thank you everybody for a great discussion. But, you know, one of the things I'm not hearing about is how we really start with young people and start the education young, get more information in the schools, whether it's private or public, and change that. So you're not changing something with someone who's an adult, but you're actually dealing with young minds who can, even if they're, you know, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, you start them understanding how there shouldn't be bias and how there should be acceptance. And as you get older, start telling all the stories. I mean, the museum in Montgomery is a really life-changing experience to go through. There are ways to bring that into the education system. There are ways to bring the story of plantations into the education system. It's very hard when you've got people who are older to try to change everything. It's like a big, big task, and you've got to start with little chunks, you know, little pieces all around, and to get to the big picture at the end of the road. If you try to change the big picture all at once, you may fail every time you try because it's too overwhelming. So, you know, you start with your neighbor, like saying you know your neighbor, but I think we really have to modify what's in our school systems also in terms of what people are hearing about history and understanding, and make people be less desensitized to violence, crime, biases, everything else, and try to put a moral compass back into the mix, because I think that's
Well, bias
missing.
isn't it's taught, isn't it? It's not automatic.
Well, it doesn't even have to be directly taught. I mean, it's something that can be absorbed almost from the environment you're raised in, and not even just your household, but the culture that you're in. You're picking up images, you're picking up associations all the time, and that's how your mind works, even when you're not conscious of it. In my book, I tell a story about my young son who was 5 years old, and we were on an airplane, and he's looking around on the plane and checking people out, and he sees a black man, and he says, she says, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane," right? And I'm like, it's like 5, right? How do you? What are you talking about? Rob the plane? Why would you say that? And he looked at me. He says, "Well, I don't know why I said that." She said, "I don't know why I was thinking that." Yeah. And so we're all getting this stuff, right? And the problem with school is that children are taught in school to not talk about race, to not mention race. By the time they're 10 years old, they already know that message. It's better to just keep silent. And so we think that this color blindness is something that's going to protect us from bias, because if you don't see color, you can't be biased. But the research shows us that that's just not true, right? And in fact, when you try not to see color, you don't see the discrimination that's happening because of color. And you're left without a language to talk about it. So those kids grow up, and then we're in this situation as adults where we can't actually even speak directly and honestly about this. We have no skills at that because we're taught to ignore it and to not pay attention, and that's the way to be a good person rather than confronting it. And by doing that, we kind of let sort of inequalities go rather than combating those inequalities, which is what colorblindness is supposed to be about.
Well, thank you so much. At this point, the organizers are wondering how to take our mics away.
Oh, sorry.
So thank you so much to our panel and all to the audience as well. Thank you.